Welcome to the debate. If I asked you what causes the most housing evictions or, bankruptcies in America, you might guess bad mortgages, risky investments, or maybe credit card shopping sprees.
Right, the usual suspects.
Exactly. But the actual answer is trapped inside the human body. Today, we are looking at a $635 billion invisible wrecking ball.
Yeah, and that wrecking ball is chronic pain and injury. I mean, we hear constantly about cancer or heart disease, and rightfully so, but the annual economic devastation of chronic pain completely dwarfs those conditions. It is just staggering.
It really is. Because the physical pain is, it's really just the opening act.
Yeah, the prolonged grinding devastation comes from the medical debt, the immediate drop in income, and, the housing stress that inevitably follow.
Which brings us to the core tension we're unpacking today. When a health crisis triggers a financial crisis, bringing about this whole cascade of ruin, are we looking at a failure of personal financial preparation? Or are we looking at a fundamental failure of our economic and healthcare systems?
I think I know where you stand on this.
Oh, absolutely. I'm arguing that the responsibility ultimately falls on the individual. Personal preparation, specifically through robust emergency savings, private disability insurance, and strict crisis budgeting, is the only reliable defense against the massive costs of recovery.
And I will be arguing that individual preparation is, practically a myth when stacked against systemic realities.
We are talking about exorbitant, opaque healthcare costs paired with an employment infrastructure that offers virtually zero wage protection.
I mean, I hear that, but
when an injury strikes and strips someone of everything they've built, it exposes a massive structural failure, not a personal budgeting error.
Look, I'm not downplaying the severity of the system's flaws. But because recovery is unequivocally an economic issue, individuals have to treat their physical health as a major financial vulnerability.
Sure, but how do they actually do that?
By planning for it. We know exactly how this plays out. The source material outlines it as the financial domino effect. A physical injury restricts your mobility, right? Restricted mobility means you can't work. Missing work halts your income.
The dominoes start falling.
Exactly. The loss of income drains whatever savings you have, which forces you onto high-interest credit cards, and suddenly your housing and your retirement are in complete jeopardy. Because we know this sequence is incredibly predictable, relying on a notoriously complex system to catch you is a deeply flawed survival strategy.
But saying relying on the system implies people actually have a choice to opt out and just, finance their own safety net. They don't. The system was fundamentally designed in a way that makes individual preparation mathematically impossible for the vast majority of working Americans.
Mathematically impossible? That is a bit of a stretch.
Is it? Look at the national dashboard right now. Nearly 100 million Americans carry medical debt. Almost a quarter of the entire population, 24.3%, lives with chronic pain.
Right, the numbers are high.
When the failure rate is that astronomically high, you cannot point to individual moral failings or a lack of coupon clipping. We are looking at a systemic trap.
It is not about coupon clipping at all. It is about risk mitigation.
But what does risk mitigation look like when recovery becomes an unpaid full-time job? You are spending hours navigating insurance appeals, managing specialist appointments, physically dragging yourself to physical therapy, all while in absolute agony.
I understand it is difficult.
It is more than difficult. When you combine missing wages with the astronomically high healthcare deductibles in this country, it vaporizes families. You simply cannot outsave structural deficits.
Let's break down those deficits, though, because I think we need to isolate the true engine of this crisis. When we analyze the actual financial hit of an injury, everyone immediately points their pitchforks at the healthcare system, the hospital bills, the deductibles.
Well, yeah, because they are massive.
They are. But the data shows the primary driver of financial ruin isn't actually the medical bills. It is the lost wages.
Well, they work in tandem, but yes, the data absolutely highlights the devastation of lost wages. If we look at the sample recovery budget from our source material, the breakdown is pretty revealing.
Right. Run through those numbers for us.
Okay, so let's say you have a 3-month recovery. The medical costs are punishing. You might hit a $5,000 out-of-pocket maximum on your insurance for surgery, then pay another $2,500 for 50 physical therapy sessions, plus $1,200 for MRIs.
So we are at nearly $9,000 right there.
Exactly. But then look at the lost wages over those same 3 months. $15,000. That single line item, the missing paychecks, accounts for well over half of the total $27,100 estimated impact of the injury.
Right, so let's pause right there. If the known primary threat is a $15,000 gap in wages, doesn't that reinforce my exact point?
How does that reinforce your point?
You don't build a bridge just hoping it never storms. You engineer it for the stress test. Why are we blaming the medical system or the broader economy for what is essentially a gap in personal income protection?
Because you are treating household budgets like corporate balance sheets.
I am treating them like reality. Think about household finances like a Jenga tower. Medical bills, the $5,000 deductible, the copays, those are blocks being pulled from the top of the tower. It makes things wobbly, it is stressful, but the tower usually stands.
Usually, sure.
Lost wages, however, are the foundational blocks at the very bottom. Once the income stops, gravity does the rest, and the whole thing collapses. If you know the foundation is that vulnerable, you need short-term disability insurance and a dedicated 3 to 6 month emergency fund to brace it.
That assumes everyone has the discretionary income to stockpile 6 months of expenses and buy supplemental private disability policies. You are talking about risk mitigation for people who actually have margins to mitigate.
People prioritize what they value.
The reality is that millions are classified as ALICE households, asset-limited, income-constrained, employed. These are hardworking people whose wages have been entirely eaten up by inflation, rent hikes, and basic living expenses.
I know what ALICE households are.
Then you know they have zero margin for error. They can't just buy a foundational Jenga block. We have an employment infrastructure that completely discards human beings the second their physical capacity drops.
Now, if you are listening to this and thinking, well, I have good insurance, I make a decent living, this ALICE stuff doesn't apply to me, let's look at a concrete example.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
The source material provides a fascinating case study of a woman named Lisa. I think her story perfectly tests this tension between personal preparation and systemic forces.
Lisa's case is incredible because she is exactly who you claim should survive this. She is 48 years old, she works as an office manager, she earns $65,000 a year, which is a solid middle-class income.
A very respectable income.
And crucially, she was responsible. Before her back injury, she'd accumulated $15,000 in liquid savings. She was contributing regularly to her retirement, her credit card debt was practically non-existent, just $2,000. She did everything the personal finance gurus tell you to do.
She had a great baseline, I will give you that.
But look at her reality 1 year after a serious back injury. Because of reduced work capacity, her income dropped from $65,000 to $42,000. Her $15,000 savings plummeted to just $2,000.
A massive hit.
She had to completely suspend her retirement contributions, and her credit card debt soared from $2,000 to $12,000. She played by the rules. She built the exact foundation you just advocated for, and the system drained her dry anyway. It is a textbook demonstration of how the sheer economic friction of chronic pain outpaces individual preparedness.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. You are looking at Lisa's baseline, but you are completely ignoring the mechanics of her adaptation.
Adaptation? What do you mean?
Earning $65,000 a year, a $15,000 safety net, was a fantastic start. That is roughly 3 months of gross income. But her outcome doesn't prove a systemic failure. It demonstrates a profound failure in crisis budgeting.
How can you look at a $23,000 drop in income and call it a budgeting failure?
Because of how she managed the drop, when her income permanently shrank to $42,000, she relied on high-interest credit cards to bridge the gap between her new reality and her old lifestyle, ballooning her debt to $12,000.
She was trying to survive?
Suspending her retirement, yes, that was a smart, necessary triage step. But taking on consumer debt instead of drastically, immediately cutting her lifestyle expenses is where her personal firewall failed. She effectively tried to maintain a $65,000 life on a $42,000 income using credit cards to subsidize the illusion that things hadn't changed.
That is,
When the storm hits, you have to adapt. You downsize the car, you cut the discretionary spending, you move to a cheaper apartment if you have to.
that is an unbelievably clinical, rigid way to view human behavior in the middle of a trauma. I want you to really picture the mechanics of what you are suggesting.
It is just math.
Lisa is navigating severe back pain. She is recovering from surgery. She is trying to appeal insurance denials, fighting to keep her job at a reduced capacity, and dealing with the massive psychological toll of losing her physical autonomy.
Which is terrible. But
And you are suggesting she should have simultaneously broken her lease, hired movers she couldn't afford, sold her car, and completely dismantle her life to avoid swiping a Visa card?
I am saying the math is unforgiving, regardless of the trauma.
But the system forces an impossible standard of hyper-adaptability on people right when they are at their absolute most vulnerable, which actually brings us to the downstream consequences of what happened to Lisa's savings. Let's talk about the threat to housing stability, because this is where the real systemic danger lies.
The connection there is vital, I agree. Once the cash buffer is gone, the shockwaves hit the basic necessities.
Exactly. The source material outlines the housing stress formula. It starts with the health crisis. That triggers the lost income. The lost income depletes the savings. The depleted savings drives up the credit card debt.
And that final step results directly in mortgage or rent stress?
Yes, leading to housing instability. Let me frame this clearly. A $2,200 mortgage doesn't shrink just because a worker's physical capacity does. We have to realize something counterintuitive here. The medical establishment is inadvertently causing the housing crisis for thousands of Americans.
That is a bold claim.
But it is true. Healthcare policy is housing policy. And the accelerant poured on this housing stress is the absurd reality of medical debt. Right now, there is $88 billion in medical debt sitting on Americans' credit reports. This debt actively destroys credit scores.
Which I agree is a brutal reality.
It is, because how do credit scores work? They are the gatekeepers to housing. If your score tanks because of an unpaid hospital bill, refinancing your mortgage to get a lower payment becomes mathematically impossible.
Okay, but
Securing a cheaper rental, which you just suggested Lisa should have done to adapt, becomes impossible because landlords reject your application. It physically locks injured people out of the housing market. Medical debt is almost always involuntary. You don't shop around for a cheaper emergency room while having a spinal crisis. We should absolutely not allow involuntary medical debt to impact credit and housing stability. It operates as a systemic punishment for getting sick.
look, I agree that medical debt is a unique and often involuntary burden. But I have to push back hard on the idea of just erasing it from credit reporting, because you are ignoring how risk modeling actually works in the financial sector.
Erasing it protects the consumer.
But it creates a massive blind spot that hurts everyone, including the consumer. Let's look at the mechanics of lending. Credit reports don't exist to judge your moral character. They exist to measure your current financial obligations, your debt-to-income ratio, or DTI, and your risk of default.
Right, but this debt shouldn't be held against them.
If a mortgage underwriter is evaluating an applicant, they need to see every monthly obligation. If we legally scrub $88 billion of actual debt from credit reports, lenders are flying blind.
Flying blind to debt that shouldn't exist in the first place.
But it does exist, and it requires a monthly payment. If a lender cannot see that an applicant is already overwhelmed by a $500 a month payment plan to a hospital, their algorithm might approve a $2,000 a month mortgage instead of a more affordable $1,500 one.
I am sorry, but I just don't buy that.
Why not? You think you are doing the borrower a favor by hiding the debt, but you are actually just setting them up for a much more catastrophic foreclosure or bankruptcy down the line because they fundamentally cannot afford the loan.
So the solution is just to lock them out of housing entirely?
No, the solution is proactive personal adaptability. Housing security requires recognizing a permanent reduction in earning potential before the bank does.
And how exactly do they do that?
If you know your earning power has dropped from $65K to $42K permanently due to a back injury, The responsible, albeit agonizing choice is to proactively downsize your housing before the stress turns into an eviction. You cannot expect the broader housing and lending markets to absorb the risk of your personal health crisis.
But downsizing is not a free action. Let's explain how that works. Downsizing requires capital. It requires first and last month's rent, a security deposit, paying for a moving truck, taking time off work to pack, all things the injury has already stripped away.
There are costs, yes, but
You are talking about an idealized recovery timeline, a straight line where you get hurt, you heal, you crunch the numbers, and you move on. But recovery is cyclical. You go through testing, you try returning to work, you relapse, you need more imaging. The financial recovery takes significantly longer than the physical one. When you tell someone in the chaotic throes of chronic pain to just proactively adapt, you are completely ignoring the immense friction the system places on them at every single step.
we can debate the friction all day, but we eventually have to figure out how people survive it. We have to look at the most viable paths forward. And I maintain that the solutions must be rooted in personal planning and existing resources that rely on individual initiative.
What resources are actually going to bridge a $23,000 income gap?
Practical, structural tools that exist right now for someone who finds themselves in Lisa's position. For debt management, individuals can and should utilize organizations like the National Foundation for Credit Counseling. They provide rigorous budgeting assistance and can negotiate structured debt reduction with creditors.
Okay, that is one tool.
If your physical capacity is permanently altered, you have to pivot your human capital. You seek out state vocational rehabilitation programs.
Vocational rehab? Seriously?
Yes. If you can't do physical labor anymore, these state programs help you adapt to a new career. Say, moving from construction or nursing into administrative work or IT, something that accommodates your physical limitations. Additionally, there are Medicare savings programs and the Patient Advocate Foundation to help you fight the system on insurance appeals.
These are all patchwork solutions.
The resources are there, but they require the injured party to take absolute ownership of their recovery and treat it like the serious economic challenge it is, rather than just waiting to be rescued.
That is a nice theory, but it completely falls apart when you zoom out. You are pointing to piecemeal charity, nonprofit counseling services, and notoriously underfunded state programs to fix a $635 billion economic black hole.
They aren't perfect, but they are actionable right now.
But think about the mechanics of what you just suggested. Vocational rehab. You can't just switch a 48-year-old nurse with a blown-out lumbar spine into a remote cybersecurity analyst overnight.
I never said it was overnight.
There is a massive training gap, a certification gap, and a hiring bias against older disabled workers. Suggesting that a 211 community assistance hotline or a credit counselor can solve the structural deficit of a worker losing their livelihood is like putting a Band-Aid on a fractured spine. It is entirely insufficient.
So what is sufficient?
Comprehensive policy reform and robust employer support. Those are the only scalable ways to prevent medical injuries from becoming housing crises. We need actual wage protection. We need comprehensive paid medical leave so people don't lose their foundational Jenga blocks on week 2 of recovery.
That would be incredibly expensive.
We need an overhaul of how healthcare costs are passed on to patients. When a system forces an injured worker to lose their home simply because they lost their physical capacity to work, the system itself requires a fundamental overhaul. You cannot budget your way out of a system designed to extract wealth from the sick.
Let's pull this together, because the economic terrain of chronic pain we've covered today is undeniably harsh. No one is disputing the absolute severity of a $27,000 financial hit from a single injury.
Right.
However, I still maintain that taking ultimate personal responsibility for your financial preparedness is the only guaranteed lifeline. We cannot control the cost of an MRI. We cannot always control the paid time off policies of our employers, but we can control our savings rates.
To a point.
We can control our debt-to-income ratios before an emergency strikes, and we can control our willingness to make hard, proactive lifestyle cuts when a crisis occurs. Relying on the hope of systemic reform is a very dangerous strategy for personal survival.
And I maintain that when 100 million Americans are carrying medical debt, we are long past the point where individual savings can outpace structural deficits.
When recovery becomes a second, unpaid job, navigating a labyrinth of appeals, appointments, and lost wages, the burden is just mathematically too heavy for the average family.
It is definitely a heavy burden.
The system routinely turns an unfortunate medical event into a catastrophic housing and retirement event. We cannot counsel our way out of this. We need structural change that protects workers rather than punishing them for being human and vulnerable to injury.
While our approaches obviously differ, I think we converge on several critical truths. First and foremost, recovery is unequivocally an economic issue, not just a medical one.
Absolutely. We both agreed that the invisible costs, the missed promotions, the delayed retirement, the compounding loss of investment growth, are tragically overlooked by the public. Everyone focuses on the hospital invoice, but the real cost is paid over decades in diminished earning power.
Right. We both recognize that health is wealth, quite literally. A single health crisis connects every major vulnerability facing working Americans today. From housing traps to household debt to employment barriers, it is all deeply interconnected.
It is. Recovery in America is clearly both a personal and systemic challenge. As the source material highlights, it requires profound personal resilience and financial planning, but it also desperately requires community support and structural adaptability.
There's much more to explore in the material regarding those community assistance networks we touched on, from the HealthWell Foundation to local workforce development boards, and we encourage everyone to examine these realities and form their own judgment on where the balance of responsibility truly lies.
The numbers are stark, and the human cost is even greater.
Indeed. We started this discussion talking about financial stability as a structure and how an internal physical crisis can crack the very foundation we rely on. When the walls of health give way, the financial consequences reach into every corner of a person's life. And for millions, the true struggle of recovery isn't just about getting better medically. It's about surviving long enough to rebuild. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.